All right, hello everybody, and welcome to episode 5 of Teacher Talk with Doc Rocker. I, as always, am your host, Russ Downey, and with me today is Danton of Doc Rocker Music and Clare Raiguel of Bach to Rock in Herndon, Virginia. How's it going, guys?
Going well.
Yeah, it's going great. Yeah, I'm excited. I haven't seen Claire in a really long time. So we're going to start, of course, with a nice brief introduction of our guest. So the way that we met Claire was that she was a student at our one of our previous music schools Russ and I used to work at, called Rock and Roll After School in Collegeville, Pennsylvania. And Claire was a drum student there, studied with both of us in passing here or there. You know, she took a couple piano lessons with me. She was involved in the school's band program, which was a really cool way to get kids to come together and collaborate and learn songwriting and pick up different instruments. And sure enough, by the end of her tenure there, Claire was pretty much doing everything. She was playing bass, she was singing, she served as a frontman for some of the bands. She plays guitar. I know the one program, she had an electric ukulele, which was really fun. So she's just a jack of all trades, but drum set is where she's really at home. So Claire, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you've been up to since you finished your days at Rock and Roll. What have you been up to, kid?
So I've been teaching now for 3 years. Started teaching when I was 18, and been coaching bands a lot. Coaching bands through Zoom has been a definite challenge, but it's been pretty cool. Teaching drums, guitar, bass, and ukulele, and piano. And it's been really fun teaching all ages from age, I think my youngest is 5 and my oldest is 54. So
cool.
It's been very fun.
Yeah. We're working with the older folks is a lot of fun. I have a bunch of like retired students that are picking up an instrument for the first time, you know, now that they're done with their careers, and they're a lot of fun to work with. It's a really, really cool market out there. So good for you, kid. That's awesome. And you're pushing how many students now a week?
Not including band students, somewhere between 30 and 40, including band students up to 50
students. That is a full-time job, dude. Good for you. That is awesome. So yeah, so we're gonna do things a little bit differently today. Normally, for those of you that have been following along with the show, you know, our host Russ Downey usually kind of leads the conversation and guides through with a couple questions to, you know, pertaining to our topic, and then we all just kind of start spitballing from there. Today, the roles are going to reverse because we're talking drums and percussion, which is one of Russ's areas of expertise. It's his main specialization. So Russ and I are going to flip roles. I'm going to be the question guy this time. So I'm going to go through our little topic sheet and kind of ask some questions. The main topic for today is teaching solo snare drum versus teaching drum set. You know, when you're working with a beginning drummer student, you know, especially within a certain age range or various age ranges, when is the right time to graduate from just snare drum with your basic rudiments to going onto a full kit and learning how to apply it to multiple drums. So there's a bunch of different points here, and there's definitely a lot of discrepancies in the teaching world. Some people, you know, some drum teachers that I've worked with in the past have jumped to drum set right away, and I've seen them use that to great success, and have students that are sitting on the kit on the first day, and you know, and they really can rock and roll and do some awesome stuff. So we're gonna kind of explore that a little bit and unpack it. So Russ and Claire are both gonna discuss their opinions, you know, on teaching snare drum versus drum set for beginning percussionists. So let's start with Claire, since you're our guest, you know, ladies first. So in your opinion, what is the best way to approach both snare drum and drum set for a beginning percussionist?
So my lessons are always run the same way across all of my drum set students, or drum students in general. Okay. I do the first 15 minutes of the lesson snare drum, second 15 minutes of the lesson drum set. First lesson, right out the gate, we start on snare drum for the first 15 minutes. Second 15 minutes, we jump to the drum set and see what we can do with what we applied on the snare drum.
So you're doing drum set on day one with a lot of your kids?
With a lot of them. Some of the younger ones who can't reach the pedals, we stay snare drum, but everyone pretty much 7 and up, first 15 minutes snare drum, second 15 minutes drum set. And we just apply every week what we learned on the snare drum to our drum set.
So now, does that also apply when you're working with, like, say, like a more advanced student? Let's say you've had a kid for like 5 or 6 years and he's in high school and he could really play. Do you still do the first 15 minutes on snare to go over like basics and warm them up, or do you spend more time on the kid at that point?
At that point, I switch to, if they're more of a drum set student, I would switch to book time for the first 10, 15 minutes, and then song time last 15 minutes.
Okay.
So I use a method book for and that's across all instruments I teach. I use a method book for at least the first 10 minutes and then jump into songs or kit for.
Yeah, and I'm sure it depends from student to student. You know, if you're anything like the way that we used to teach at Rock and Roll After School, a lot of the curriculum was very student centralized. And I'm sure you have a lot of kids like, I want to learn this song by the Beatles, or I'm into this artist and I want to learn their stuff. And that we you know, us teachers kind of work that in and weave it in and use that material to teach the concepts we want to teach. Which I've always found to be really fun. So, so Russ, let's switch over to you. I know you're kind of a little more on the opposite side, right? You have a much bigger emphasis on spending a lot of time with just the snare drum by itself.
Yeah. The real big thing is, to one extent, I do want to give the caveat that it is age dependent, depending on, you know, when I started people on snare drum or drum set. But really, a lot of times for drum students, when they're complete beginners and they've never picked up a set of drumsticks before, I spend a good bit of time early on snare drum, mostly because it is the easiest way, in my opinion, to teach technique, to teach reading, which I'm really, really big on, being able to actually like read notation and being able to read drum set notation later on. So a lot of times when I have like drummers who start maybe at age 6 or 7, we're reading drum set for a good few months before we actually get to the kit. And most of that's because my goal is that when they actually sit down to play the kit, provided they are tall enough to reach the different parts of the kit, that the reading part of it is not an issue. They're not like, okay, what's that note? My goal is that they're able to read up to 16th notes before they hit the drum set, because now you're basically talking about all those rhythms we just learned and now reading 3 lines at once, essentially, which can throw some students for a loop, in my opinion, from what I've seen before. And my goal with them is really to take away the kind of the mental uneasiness aspect of reading that many things at once, because in the only other instrument where you're typically reading that much all at once in like multiple lines would be piano, quite often. And in that case, you know, for a drum set player, they have multiple limbs to coordinate all at once. So my goal is to take away like the part of having to worry about what you're reading, what your notes are, basically those parts of it, so that when they sit down to the kit, they could concentrate on just getting the coordination down and the reading part. Now, that doesn't mean for like older drummers, I do tend to skew the time more differently. For my younger drummers, I usually tend to do like 2/3 to 1/3 snare drum to drum set until they hit about, I'd say anywhere from like 10 to 12 years old. For those that are like 13 and older, most of the time we're spending a good bit of time on the kit, provided they've played it before. If they haven't, we're still doing snare drum for like the first 10 or 15 minutes to work on the read, and then we're hitting the kit to work on either a song or sometimes working out of some different books. I know myself personally, and I could talk about this later, but I'm a big fan of Tommy Igoe's Groove Essentials book.
I love that book. I have some experience with that as well. Yeah, it's really great.
A lot of times, you know, we're really spending a lot of time with a great emphasis on reading, and rudiments are a large part of that with the, you know, the snare drum part as well. But yeah, I'm a big proponent of starting with snare drum first. And that's kind of where I sit on that side of it.
No, and also, this is something to consider. I know in Claire's teaching environment, the lessons are just a half hour, right? Or are they 45 minutes? Okay, so when you have only 30 minutes compared to 45 minutes for your lessons, compared to even, I know in some cases schools offer a full 60-minute class. You know, you kind of, I kind of like the way Russ was framing it, as far as like just thinking like this third or this many thirds of the lesson, kind of breaking it down into thirds. So if you're working on a 30-minute time frame, 10, 10, 10, you know, you get the idea. Mm-hmm. So, and that definitely is something to factor in. So for you other teachers out there that are tuning in and you're looking to, whether, you know, you're a teacher like me who specializes in a lot of non-drum instruments and is looking to get some experience teaching drum set, kind of thinking of breaking your lesson down into thirds is always a good idea. I mean, there's a number of reasons why that could be a good idea, but so that's just something to keep in mind, you know, factoring in how much time you have to work with the student each and every week. So, and Russ, so in your case, when you're starting your students just on snare drum only, what's the overall, what's your estimated like time frame of how many weeks or months that a student is just doing snare before they get to that point where they are pretty comfortably able to subdivide 16ths? And
I would usually say, give or take, it's usually anywhere from like 3 or 4 months to about 6 months. And most of that depends on how quickly they move through the material. Like if this is their first time learning an instrument and they're like 6 or 7 years old, it may take us a little while, because not only are we learning how to read, but we're also learning technique, the coordination, the stance, the proper way to hold the sticks, all those type of things that have to be reinforced over time. And you know, that makes it a little bit longer. I can tell you, one of my first students who started taking drum lessons when he was 6, He was on snare drum for quite a while before we hit the drum set. Now, part of that was because at the time he wasn't tall enough to reach a good bit of the stuff on the kit, which does obviously prove some issues logistically. But it was about, I'd say about probably 7 months before he hit the drum set for the first time.
Yeah, and then once he got into drum set and started exploring it properly, he became one of your best players, though, right?
Yeah, he did. I mean, the good thing is he was, constantly putting out the time practicing, which is awesome. And, always proves the point that practice helps a lot with everything you do. But yeah, it was a lot of times because when I would put something in front of him to read or to be able to play, he was doing fine with being able to read through what was there. And a lot of it was just we would still spend a little bit of time on snare drum, working on reading, and then jump to the kit and work on playing a song or work on something out of a book. And it worked out great.
Very cool. So there you have it. At that point, like I could speak from what limited experience I have. I've only ever taught 2 drum students ever in my life, and I had both students for a good couple of months each, and they both came in roughly the same age and total beginner. So naturally, I turned to Russ for a lot of advice on what should I do, what methods should I use, what are the proper ways to hold the stick. I was kind of like jumping in and learning to teach as I was teaching, and for me it was really, really fun. And I was kind of put in a camp where I had Russ as one of my colleagues who is, as you just heard, he's really kind of rooted in this camp of like really stick with the basics on snare for a good extensive period to really establish a good proper foundation and to really, give the student time to develop all of the fine motor skills used for stick technique, to develop them to the point where it's second nature and they don't have to think about how they're holding the sticks or how they're sitting with a pad or how they're standing with one. A lot of times I'd have my students stand, but every once in a while I have them try to sit with a pad as well, so kind of give them more of a sensation of what it's like to sit on a throne of a drum kit before we transitioned into the drum kit. So getting to the point where like reading is not an issue, stick technique is not an issue, posture is not an issue, and then we finally transition and apply all of those skills that we learned in a basic format on the snare drum to then putting them onto the drum kit. And for me, it had a really nice payoff. By the time I worked within a smaller, narrower window of time, I didn't set as many weeks aside to just working on stick technique, and I only took my students to eighth notes. I think it was mainly just because of how young they were. And I think I had 1 or 2 very not successful lessons doing 16th notes with 1 or 2 of them. And I just thought, let's just stick with 8th notes for now. We'll go to the kit. We'll do something to kind of mix it up, because there's definitely that cool factor when you get to play on a drum set. You get to hit all these different kinds of drums that make all these different kinds of sounds, and there's all these little pedals and levers and gizmos and gadgets and all this stuff you can play with. It's like a toy factory for kids, and there's definitely that immediate appeal of like, oh, I want to do all the cool stuff I see a drummer do on TV when they're playing a drum set. So there's always like that inherent pressure, not to mention from parents getting that, when are they going to start getting on drum set? How much are they going to be just doing these same little rat-a-tat things on a practice pad? And so for me, I kind of tried a little bit of a middle ground approach, because there was another drum teacher at the school we worked at who was very much the polar opposite. He was all drum set all the way from day one with all of his students, and he was also very successful. And that was what really interested me as an outside perspective drum teacher, of having that. All right, well, here's a guy that's like all snare all the way, and then here's a guy that's no snare nonsense whatsoever. Let's just jump on the kit. And both teachers had very successful students. So I tried pretty much putting the 2 strategies into a blender and trying to do a little bit of something my own. So like, let's stick with snare for the first like 2 months, maybe even a little shorter than that. And then let me try and get to drum set a little earlier, and then we can kind of go back and forth. And then when we're ready to upgrade, to reading more advanced subdivisions like 16ths and triplets, maybe then we go back to snare to learn the rhythms, and then we can apply those to the kit as well. Unfortunately, I never got that far because our teaching days at that school were numbered, but that's a topic for a whole different episode. Don't worry about that. So what I would like to explore, what I think would be a really fun bit for, especially the 2 of you to talk about, what are some of the benefits to spending a considerable amount of time on snare drum, and what are some of the benefits to getting on the kit earlier? So, Claire, maybe you want to kind of start us off, whether you, if you pick a side or kind of jump in, what do you think?
Well, having learned from starting snare drum day one, I've always been more towards starting snare drum day one. I do feel like snare is very important, and I start that in the same lesson, but before they go to the drum set. The main reason I think it's important to start on drum set is to get the coordination down of using more than one limb. So even when I am doing snare drum stuff, I have them keeping time with their kick drum or their left foot hi-hat or back and forth kick, hi-hat, kick, hi-hat. That's why I like the syncopation for the Modern Drummer book, one of my favorite ones to use, because it has that kick written in there. So you're practicing reading kick and the rudiments in your hands and the rhythms and everything. So that way they're still getting that coordination of playing kick 4 on the floor, essentially, while playing rhythms on the snare drum. So I feel like it's important to get that limb independence from day one, start working on that limb independence and not just both hands. But I do see how it is important to also start on snare drum and get down the reading and everything that Russ was saying as well. I just feel like limb independence is one of the most important parts of drums. So I want to start that right away.
That is a really good point. I didn't even think of that. Because we've already talked so much about the physical aspect of just basically holding the sticks and sitting properly on the throne, but even just having that physical aspect of limb independence when a student's on the kit, that is another so important topic. Russ, do you ever find when you transition your students from snare to kit that becomes an issue since you've spent a good bit of time just doing snare drum first, or not so much?
In some cases it can. Most of the time I've had a decent amount of success with it because I usually have like kind of a guided path of songs I use for teaching like a progression of skills going through that. Of which case it kind of takes them from limbs working very much in coordination together to slowly building that independence, which usually manifests mostly as like more independent bass drum, more independent bass drum patterns for the right foot. But I've had a few occasions where like we take a lesson or two to try and get all 3 limbs together at the same time. And that takes a little while too, but that's usually like once they've got all 3 together after a lesson or two, they're comfortable playing all of them together. So that's kind of like putting the limb independence kind of towards the back end of it as we jump over to drum kit for the first time. But we spend a lot of time on that in like the lesson on its own or the next lesson as well, as a means to kind of building that all together so they can feel comfortable with where each of them typically will sit. And I'll just take like a standard drum beat, like 1 and 3 on the bass drum, 2 and 4 on the snare, and 8th notes on the hi-hat, and typically start with that. The odd part is I found that most of the time starting with 8th notes on the hi-hat seems to give better results than starting with quarter notes on the hi-hat, which is
I agree with that.
I never would have thought that.
I never even would have thought of using quarter notes as a basic timekeeper. I just jumped right into eighths just because I just know how common it is from, like I said, from the perspective of a non-drummer, knowing what little about drums I do. I mean, like I get you would use quarter note hi-hats for like a halftime groove, but those are few and far between compared to a standard 8th note beat, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are some songs that do use, quarter notes in a regular style drum beat as well. They are more few and far between than ones using 8th notes. I think having the 8th note subdivision really helps for a lot of drummers as they're first starting to put it together, because they can hear like this constant click in the background as they try and put together where the bass drum and the snare drum go. I will say that, when they're first starting on the kit, I typically avoid having them play something that has the bass drum and the snare drum at the same time until they get used to it, because that concept of having like snare drum and bass drum both on the same beat, like let's say you have quarter notes on the floor for, 4 on the floor for the bass drum and 2 and 4 on the snare, that idea of I have to play all 3 limbs all at the same time, well, all 3 they're using, obviously,
right,
is it's kind of mind-boggling sometimes for a drummer who's just starting on kit. But typically that's why I'll pick songs while they're just like, beats 1 and 3 on the bass drum, and they can play them at a separate time, and they only have to really worry about 2 at a time as they're getting started, as I'm literally miming the motions of playing that beat where the camera can't see it. So but yeah, that's my feeling behind it.
Okay, and that's really interesting. I never would have thought of, it seems that having like a pre-planned set of materials, like songs to select from, like a kind of path, like first learn song A given to you by your teacher, that's gonna, and you can kind of, and it becomes an effective means of scaffolding, right? Of like,
That's
all right, let me then gradually build in songs that have more complex grooves and patterns to eventually, now we're doing stuff where there's more frequent fills and there's a lot more emphasis on limb independence. I know from what experience I had as a drum student, I took a drum set course in college for a semester, and it was really fun, but it was one of those things where like, the professor jam-packed so much awesome content into just a brief 15-week course, and I feel like we kind of like just had enough to kind of like touch on so many different things, and then it was off to the next thing. But for the first couple classes that we were doing a basic rock beat, I was kind of surprised from the perspective of a non-drummer to come in and like right away they're doing like the syncopated openings of the hi-hat, like on the and 4, stuff like that. I mean, it was a really fun groove to learn. And once I learned how to actually play it, I was like, oh man, drum set is actually really cool and fun. And I like this. I want to
very cathartic.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So like, but of course that would not be I mean, of course, this college course was designed for music majors that don't specialize in drum set, which is why I took it as a piano student. It's like, oh, I should learn more about drums so that way I could teach it and I can, whatever. So, so like for me, like, and for that class, we used the IGO book that Russ, that you mentioned earlier, the Groove Essentials, which is a fantastic book, but I'm not sure I would be using that book right away with a beginning student, especially like I didn't use it with my younger kids that I had at the time. I ended up I forget if I either found a book that was at the school that I was at, or if I had something else in my library, or if, I forget, or if I just wrote out basic patterns myself and then came up with a couple of different sort of permutations of that, but nothing involving that like fourth limb of getting the other leg to do different things. But I would imagine that would be a really cool way to kind of bridge that gap from your beginning drum set students into ones that are more advanced and could do more complex music, right?
I mean, yeah, essentially what it comes down to is that like my goal for a drum set student as they're first starting out is like 3 limbs, no more, until they've gotten comfortable being able to play a beat. Like if I put something up on a whiteboard and said, here, play this beat, and they can figure it out and play it. Once we've gotten to that point, I slowly introduce like using the left foot as opening and closing the hi-hat, but it's in a very limited capacity to start. So most of it, the reason I choose what I choose is a super high amount of scaffolding to basically build skills one at a time. Kind of think of it like, doing an experiment in a science class where you only want to have one variable at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
you gradually introduce more variables.
Exactly. Yeah, because if you start on like multiple things at once, you have students who wind up getting a little confused as to like, well, what am I supposed to do again, or how do I do that? So one thing at a time.
Before I add left foot hi-hat, I always add the 8th and 16th note combination between hi-hat and kick. It's like a 1 and a 2, stuff like that. Before I add left foot hi-hat. I have found that a lot of my students are getting to that point right now. So I pick
that's cool.
like I tend to pick like one song across the board for all my students who started at the same time to teach them. And currently that's been Walk This Way by Aerosmith, because it has that, especially the ones who are learning the open hi-hat and the 8th and 16th note combinations, it has like everything I need for that.
It's like a textbook. Here's everything you could do with a hi-hat and a rock song, basically. Yeah. Song. It's awesome. That's a great selection. Russ, what are some of your suggestions for like starting drum set pieces for beginning students?
One of the ones that I've always started with, even though I do leave one key part of it out, is Private Eyes by Hall & Oates. And the reason being is that there's no fills in the song at all.
Ooh, that's
straight 8th note beat where you're 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. The only thing is there's a hi-hat like an open and close that I just politely throw out of there for the first time they try it and come back to it later when they learn it, because again, it's always in the same place. It's a great example, but that song has very little variance to it. It is basically the same thing from start to finish, which for a Hall & Oates tune, that's what that tune needs perfectly. There's like nothing wrong with that because of the type of song it is, but it's great because it's not too fast, it's not too slow, and it has no variance. It's just a great sandbox to try that beat literally for like 3 minutes. So that's one of my first ones I usually go to. After that, my main goal is to start adding more to the bass drum part, and that could be a whole host of songs. I've had some kids working on some Styx tunes before. I've had others working on some Tom Petty tunes before. As I start to like introduce some more bass drum stuff to it, or starting to introduce minor fills into things, that type of stuff.
Basically. Cool. Yeah. So maybe we can take a little trip and talk about more specific examples before we move on to our next topic. Maybe we can go through. So we have right there are 2 really great selections of what you could do first with your students. And let's say now you've had a student who is really well established on snare and they're playing kit. Maybe you're at a point now for both of you where you're teaching your kids pretty much maybe 50-50 of each lesson, half the lessons on snare, half the lessons on kit, and they've mastered maybe the first 2 or 3 songs you've thrown at them, maybe 1 or 2 of their own interested songs as well. Where do we go from there?
I teach Cheap Thrills by Sia a lot because it's a song that a lot of them recognize, and they also it actually has some pretty cool beats in it for music that I don't normally listen to. It has a lot of really cool syncopated patterns in it, and a lot of like a do ga do ga do ga do ga kind of thing in it.
Nice.
That teaches kind of like an intro to like Latin beats.
I was gonna say,
that
sounds like it's got Latin written all over it.
Yeah, so I like exploring different genres while using things that they recognize the sound of too. Saying, hey, we can dive into a Latin song or Latin beats going from Cheap Thrills, which you've heard on the radio 50 million times.
Right. It makes a really great segue. Exactly. Yeah, that's a really good idea.
And then in Intro to Fills, I teach kind of like the beginning, middle part of Come Sail Away by Styx. There's some
parts of that are a little bit more difficult.
There's one part in it that can't say it, but I don't know how to drum talk it, but it's one part
I think it's right after the keyboard solo where there's doom. You get the idea. All these like huge fills like once every beat as I immediately start playing the fills and trying to speak through it.
I love hearing drummers talk.
Hey man, we have our own language about like how we talk through drum stuff.
I love it. It's hilarious. I think it's super cool. And I'm just laughing because I'm jealous and I can't do it.
It's a good thing it sticks and not Rush because I'd be sounding like absolute nonsense if I was speaking.
Oh God. Oh, I don't think I've ever heard you like scat through a Rush tune before. We could probably do a whole episode on that.
Yeah, we could. I am not biased at all. That post in the background says otherwise.
Yeah, exactly.
Another one I do a lot is Don't Stop Believing.
Oh,
it has that offbeat snare.
It does. That's true. Yeah, it does. Yeah, that's true. You're right.
Yeah.
That's a good one too. That's actually really good for like left hand independence too, because you're using both like tom and snare throughout that song. So yeah, that's a good one too. God, I learned that one years ago.
Then occasionally with my older ones, I do the first song I learned on drums, which was Make Damn Sure by Taking Back Sunday. So a lot of them don't know that one, and I can't do it with my younger one because of words.
Because of the nature of the title. Yeah, parents might, not be so happy with that, but
I think that, and sometimes I just teach them the beats from it without playing the song for them. But that's the first song I learned on drums because it has a floor tom beat. It has a nice little, in the pre-chorus, it has this nice little fill into the chorus to teach where fills go, like conventionally where fills go. And also it has just like a nice quarter note crash beat with some cool kick patterns. And then that's where I also implement double kick when they get to that level, by taking that song that they learned so far at the beginning and saying, hey, add double kick to this and make it sound cooler. I do that with a lot of songs that they learn at the beginning when they go, hey, I just got a double kick pedal. What the heck do I do with this?
That's a whole other topic we could get into maybe a little later. We could talk about the importance of like double bass and like, is it important and how to teach it, and how to get into it and how to kind of mix that into all the other stuff you have planned. So yeah, interesting. Very interesting. So something that we kind of touched on a little bit before, and I know this is definitely a major factor in teaching anybody the drums, age range and students' physical size, right? So it's something, like I said, we touched on it a little bit earlier on, and I'd like to maybe take a minute and kind of step back and look at that in a little more detail, especially going into this snare drum set debate. What factor does the age of the student play in making those decisions of when, let's say you are doing the snare drum only method, what factor does age play in the decision to move the student onto drum set? What factor does it make in the overall pacing of the lessons and, the planning of your curriculum, etc.? I'm not sure how much, I would imagine for a lot of you guys, you pretty much get students coming in usually starting around the same age range, but maybe you have an example of you've had like an older student come in later on, 12, 13.
Actually, I've had one or two come in who were like around the 12 to 13 area, and the balancing is definitely different. The one thing is that you know that from a physical standpoint that they're going to be having a much easier time with the fine motor skills needed for being able to, have the coordination to play a drum kit and coordinate multiple limbs at a time. That's one part of it. So usually I'll typically start with like maybe snare for a few lessons and then work drum set in slowly but surely. But in that case, I'm spending a lot more time like starting on basic drum songs just to get the kit, under their fingers, so to speak. Um, and in that case, a lot of that is also due to the fact that, for older kids, especially for those who are just becoming teenagers, it's not necessarily as much the cool factor, but, snare drum doesn't hold interest quite as well. And that's understandable because
it's only one sounding drum, right? As opposed to the different pitches of the toms and the different textures of the cymbals and things.
That's why usually, in that case, it's usually like younger drummers or younger students who have an easier time sticking with snare drum for a while because they're first just learning. They're taking the time, they're getting everything down. But when you're teaching teenagers, they also have music that they're interested in as well, of which you do have to balance that, which is a big part of it because you want them to enjoy what they're doing. So you find ways to try and find something that is reasonable for them to try playing or something that they're going to have an easy enough time with that they won't get frustrated, but presents enough of a challenge that they'll actually, get something out of it. I know I've had students of mine where they wanted to, play like either some AC/DC or some Queen before. So we have to find examples of that, are comfortable enough for them to try, that aren't going to make them hit that frustration wall and be spending like months on it trying to get it down. Because that frustration wall is real to the point where I've seen people stop playing because they've hit that wall,
Yeah, and that's really sad. And that's, of course, the last thing you want as a teacher for any instrument. Is to get to that point where like you're struggling so much with one thing. Sometimes it's better to even if we're like doing it wrong, let's just do it wrong and we'll come back to it later when you're a little more prepared, just for the sheer sake of keeping interest. I can speak, that's happened to me with piano students all the time. So it's like, all right, we'll come back to this some other day. What's that?
Happened to me with a bass student who told me that his dad told him that he could get a big bag of Sour Patch Kids if he learned Crazy Train in his first lesson on bass.
Oh,
it's like,
oh no.
I was like, I can't, I'll
how do you
teach you
even
the
start?
beginning.
I can teach you the first little bump.
Yeah.
Can't really get too much further than that in 30 minutes though. Yeah, especially on day one. It's like there are 4 different strings and all the strings have, a number of frets, and you got to know how to tune it. You got to know how to plug it in. You got to know, are you using a pick? Are you using your fingers? Are you using slap? I mean, of course, you're not going to be teaching slap to a bass student on day one.
Oh, come on, they get in the first lesson, right?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, you can totally get. Oh yeah,
no problem.
All the bass players that are in the teacher talk group are just rolling their eyes right now.
No, I mean, that actually presents a really good point because you have students or sometimes parents who are like, they want to learn this song, and the unfortunate part is that we're kind of in this position that's an unenviable one of telling them like, hey, they're not going to be in a position to do this yet for a little while. And the thing is that I find it's a tough balance sometimes between like what a student may want to do and where they're actually at skill wise. And, as long as you're honest with them, tell them like, look, here's where your skills are at. Here's where they're going to need to be able to play this. I usually find that they're pretty much okay with it working towards that goal. But, sometimes they have something they really want to do. And, I'm not going to stop somebody who's motivated to try it on their own, but I don't want it to be a situation where they're feeling frustrated with because there's something they want to play and they can't.
Yeah, and they're just not there yet. That's actually a big problem for me as a teacher. Because for me, like, I just always like to set the bar as high as possible. And I like to kind of think with a student, the sky's the limit. Like, yeah, you can do whatever you want. And even if it's something that I know is going to be too hard for them, it's like, let's just jump in. Because sometimes for me, it's been really successful. Like I'll always give like the warning, like, hey, that piece of music is pretty difficult. But I'm all for trying it. I'd rather try and fail than not bother trying at all. That's a big part of my MO. And I've had a couple of really, really inspiring lessons with students of all different ages and skill levels where they kind of jump into something that's a little over their head. And after a couple of weeks, they grind it out and step up and really rise to the occasion and master it. And that's a really good feeling for me as a teacher. But it's a very high risk, high reward kind of thing because you really, really easily run that risk of them getting frustrated because they can't play something they really enjoy. And then it becomes, what's the point of me even doing this? And why am I even taking lessons if I can't get to that goal right now? And, especially this might be something I'll say for the good gripes segment at the end of the episode, something where like, there's always that inherent pressure from the parents of, my son's been taking lessons for X amount of time. Why can't he do this thing yet? And it's like, well, that thing takes like 10 years to learn how to do. You know what I mean? So, but that's a more universal topic, not even so much specifically for drum set, but anyway.
I mean, Claire, how do you balance that with, with your students that you teach for drums in terms of like, finding something that they're going to enjoy, or something, having them pick out something, but something that's within their reach? What do you usually do?
So one of the good things about where I teach is we have arrangements that they provide the teachers, and we have them leveled 1, 2, and 3. So they can learn a song that they aren't necessarily ready to play the exact version of, but they can learn the level 1 version, which is modified to make it easier. Or if we don't have the song readily printable for me, I can modify it myself. So if they have a song that they really want to learn, say they want to learn Come Sail Away by Styx, and that's just the song they come in, they're like, I'm learning drums because I want to learn Come Sail Away. Not normally what happens, but could. Then I would.
You have a student for 3 years, easy. That's good enough.
I normally would take a song that they want to play or something that is similar and modify it. Make it so and I tell them, I let them know this isn't going to sound exactly like the song, but this is something that without all the bells and whistles, this is the backbeat of the song. Yeah. And I find also, I had a question for you, Russ, too, about how you approach when students like music that don't have drums in it, that doesn't have drums in it. That just reminded me of that.
I actually had a student who did some of this before, which is actually pretty awesome. It's pretty recent. I had a student who's a real big fan of video game music. And Dan's probably smiling from ear to ear right about now, although he won't be smiling when I mention which game it's from. The student was a real big fan of Legend of Zelda, and was also a real big fan of The Wind Waker.
Okay.
Yeah, I know how this one will go. And there's a theme in the game called Dragon's Roost Island. There's a place in the game, and it's got a really cool Latin beat to it. And we kind of took what was there and took the core essence of it and turned it basically into almost like a fast 3/4 or 6/8 type of feel, where basically you're talking about 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, 3, with cross stick and bass drum and hi-hat, basically just keeping coordinates on the hi-hat. And it worked great. It was very basic in terms of like what we did with that, but the song itself normally has like no drums to it. It's all auxiliary percussion. So it was kind of an interesting way to be able to teach a little bit of a Latin feel, but also in 3/4 at the same time. So in some cases like that, it's literally just hearing like the essence of the song and kind of jamming on it a little bit to see what you come up with, and then dialing it back based off of your drum students' level, what they can handle. And in some cases, basic syncopation may be what they're comfortable with. In other cases, they may be able to handle more depending on where they're at.
Yeah, I have a student who loves video game music. It was just like, as you said, I was like, there isn't really that much drums in Super Mario Bros. Theme song.
I had a student work on Bob on Battlefield from the Super Mario 64.
Oh, that's a good one. That is a really nice.
There's like Super Soul Bros, which is one of the fantastic group out there that is like a funk band that does covers of video game music, and they've got some great stuff there. So yeah, there's some good stuff in the Mario soundtracks for drum set. It's a blast, but it all comes from like the later games. And I know Dan can probably tell you about that too.
Well, we could easily do episode after episode on video game music, especially if I'm here, because that's kind of my thing too. I mean, video games, heck, that's even why I got into music in the first place. Anyone who knows me knows that about me. But for situations like that, I've had that happen to me a lot of times as a piano teacher too, of like, oh, I want to learn this thing that doesn't even have piano in it. It's usually for me, well, for one thing, we could usually adapt it pretty well for the piano, but if we can't, I always go to the field of composition of why don't we just make something? Why don't we just add a piano part to it? Yeah. So that would be my first thought as a drum teacher is like, oh, I want to learn this thing and it doesn't even have any drums in it at all. Well, heck, let's add drums. Let's make up our own beats. Let's break down the time signature of the song, come up with a couple ways you can, effectively time keep. And if you're playing on kit, we can make the decisions of hi-hat versus ride or crash, whatever. And then let's come up with distinct beats for each of the sections of the song, depending on how the song overall is formed and structured. And then, maybe we could even, maybe have them like literally transcribe their composition, and then they can add like, and for me, I think that could be superbly educational in many factors of, if you're at the point where you can you can create your own music using the skills you've learned in your lessons. I find that to be the highest form of mastery. So even for a beginner level kid, like, all right, if you can do like eighth note beat A, B, and C, let's just plug those in whatever order you want for the song and see what kind of arrangement we can come up with. And then we could talk about, like, all right, let's say we made decision A for this section, and it didn't quite sound the way you wanted to. Maybe we change it. Okay, let's put idea B in there instead, and we'll save idea A for something else. Like, I find that like that kind of higher level thinking, I really think it's never too early a time to do that. I mean, unless of course it's like you have a student who's just starting and doesn't
It's
have
their
any
second
skills
lesson.
to work with.
And they want to play like, some crazy composition. Like, yeah, we could do that. No,
Yeah. So of course there are limits to when you can do it, but I tend to set those limits to be as low as possible, and, try to even encourage, this is something, especially from my experience teaching at Rock and Roll After School for all the years I've done, where there was a big emphasis on student creativity. And I always found that component to be really fun and interesting. Even if some of the end results were not like the most perfectly, you don't have like your verse chorus song, and it's a little weird and off the wall, but that's part of what made it fun, I think.
Well, I think that actually presents a really interesting point too. And, Claire, you can obviously speak to this, having been a student there, but that creativity part of it, you only get good at creating by creating. That's the
Exactly.
only way really, yeah.
Yeah.
And you're basically having the student arrange at that point. They're basically arranging a drum part for something that does not contain a drum part. So it's never too early to start that creativity.
I would agree 100%.
Yeah, you could treat it as like a joint process. Like, okay, if you want to learn this song, let's sit down and figure out what actually goes well with this. Let's take a listen to it and kind of figure out what the beat is, and we'll work on it together,
Yeah.
And that's kind of a cool thing.
That would be awesome. I've never gotten to actually do that firsthand with a student due to my lack of experience, but that would be something I would very much love to do in the future.
I've had, I remember the one time, I have a hard time with my younger little girl bands that like to do pop music that has no drums. And then there's a drummer in their band. So I took my go-to piano teaching song, Say Something by Great Big World, because it's super simple to teach on piano. And they're like, there's no drums for the first like minute and a half of this song. What is our little drummer 8-year-old girl gonna do? Just sit behind the drum set with her pink sticks.
And wants to play. Yeah, right.
So we came up with this really cool, she's actually very advanced at 9 years old, and she came up on her own with this really cool ride brush snare beat that actually turned out really cool. That band is one of my most fun to teach because they're just so creative. They came up with a song about ukuleles dancing on a beach. And
I love it.
And they write all the time. But my favorite moment with them was when she came in with that brush beat on the ride and the snare. I just was wondering how you guys approached teaching songs that don't have the instruments that you're teaching in them.
My philosophy, just add the instrument anyway. Who cares? You got a band of a bunch of shredders and metalheads and you got a keyboard player, let's just add piano to it, whatever.
I've done that.
we'll make it fit, and it'll be awesome.
There are very few circumstances where you can't find something to fit into an arrangement of something else. And a lot of the times, it also builds that ability for them to be able to do that on their own. I think one of the reasons I kind of take the approach I do most of the time is that I want them to have the skills they need to be able to learn something they want to learn on their own, not necessarily always be like, okay, well, here's what I have in mind I want to learn. I'm like, okay, we could do that. But I also want you to be able to like have those skills that if you want to learn something when you're not in lessons, you have those skills available to you. And in that creation sense, that could be like, I want to write a drum beat to like the underwater theme from the original Super Mario Bros. It's a waltz in 3/4 and turn it into a Latin beat or something like that. You could do it. You can, but you need those requisite skills to be able to kind of figure that out. And I think by going through situations like that, they gain the skills just as much as you do.
I remember being in lessons when Danton was my band coach. And I think there was one other teacher in there too, and they had completely different teaching styles, but I always found that they both gave me the tools to be able to create what I wanted to create at home. So we'd work on it at home and then go in. And I always thought that was a really good quality in a teacher, was to be able to give you the skills that you need to do to be able to do it on your own without as much guidance.
Well, that was my goal. I'm glad to hear that that I've achieved my goal of being an effective teacher. There is no like any fancy piece of paper that says you're smart doesn't hold a candle to actually hearing that from one of your older students. So thank you. That's really awesome to hear. So yeah, again, just a really quick little, just a big part of my teaching style is put the ball in the student's court as much as possible and give them, kind of that freedom to kind of explore not only what the content is, but also as far as how they go about learning it. And I found that can be really interesting, especially in this case for drum set, because you can literally, so let me ask you guys this. How many instances, if let's say you have a student who's now, 8 months to a year in, and they're pretty well versed, and they've made the successful transition from snare drum to kit, and you're balancing it maybe 50-50 in your lessons, just like the other example before. And now you're exploring a new song, whether it's a song you've assigned him or her, or if it's a song if she or he decided to do themselves. How much of your instructional time on learning to play the new song that's written for kit, how much of that time do you spend on snare alone? Maybe you like working out some of the rudiments that are used in some of the fills, or some of the maybe if there's any kind of particular rhythmic discrepancies, how much of the kit stuff do you work out on just a practice pad? Or do you maybe you just jump right into the kit? What do you guys do? I'm curious to hear.
Go ahead, Claire.
The way that I typically approach picking a song in general is whatever we've been doing on the snare, we apply by picking that song that used what we were doing on the snare. Okay. So we did that the week before is my answer to your question, is we already did what we needed to do for that song on snare. And then maybe in the beginning of that lesson, we continue it on snare, whatever we were working on.
Kind of like a recap, like a brief little review, warm-up introduction.
Say we were working on triplets. They were working on triplets, and we warm up with a triplet warm up that day because we're working on a song that has a whole bunch of triplets in it.
Okay.
So I normally, when I introduce triplets to a student, then I find a song on drum set or a beat on drum set that has triplets in it so that they can apply what they learned on their snare drum to their song.
So in your case, it always goes hand in hand because you plan the lessons that way from the get-go, you're saying. Yes. Okay.
I know myself personally, in some cases, things do coincide. Like if we're working on a particular rhythm, let's say we're working on learning like, an 8th and 16th hybrid with like 1 end to 2 end to 3 end to 4 end. That's, sometimes good for working like on a hi-hat pattern. I know one of the songs I've used to teach that before is Too Much Time on My Hands by Styx, which I love that song. But the thing is that like, for me, a lot of the times, if it's an issue of something on drum kit, we work it out on drum kit most of the time.
Okay.
Mostly because the actual issues you'll run into with the drum kit itself can be solved there. And a lot of times, if it's a fill, it's obviously more than one drum. As far as rhythms go, you can usually work them out on drum kit as well. So it's not quite so.
You don't need to really be laying as much of that groundwork once they're already on.
Right. The only time I really find that being a major issue is if it's a particular rhythm that they're working on that is something that will be much better served by starting out on snare drum and then taking it to the kit. But the majority of the time, by the time they're on the kit and working on something, you can usually work it out on the kit.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me. Like I said, I'm really not much of one to talk on this week's episode because I am not really much of a drummer or a drum teacher. But yeah, so moving on to our next point, we've already covered a good bit of, kind of comparing the two different strategies and lots of different scenarios in which either of these teaching strategies could be applied very effectively, but kind of taking a step back to basics. I know we talked about, we briefly mentioned a couple of method books for teaching grooves and patterns on set. We talked about the Tommy Igoe book. There was, Claire, there was the one book that you mentioned that you use a lot.
Syncopation for the Modern Drummer. It's mostly snare. Yeah.
Oh, that's just for snare only?
It's snare, but there's kick on 1, 2, 3, 4 on all the beats.
Oh, okay. So what are some of the books then you guys use when you're in those early phases of just teaching basics on the snare drum? What are your go-tos for that?
I think when it comes time for like the very early, especially if you have a student who's like 6 or 7, some of the older books tend to be a little heavy duty to look at first, because they're, it always seems like they're geared towards learners who are starting in elementary school, which would be like those who are about 9 or 10 years old. So I'll usually start off with something that starts a little bit more slowly, like maybe, I know it's kind of a basic choice, but like the Essential Elements, even though it's like a band method series, it takes it very slowly to start with how it introduces rhythms, with how it introduces notation. And I find that that gives like a nice, comfortable start that I can blend with stuff outside of the book to kind of get them up to speed. There's other ones I'll use, like the Rhythm Reading for Drums by Garwood Whaley. I love that name. That's fantastic. But in any case, that's a good one too, that starts off with some really basic stuff to start. And a lot of times I find for the younger drummers, part of the reason we spend so much time there as well is because you really want to drive home those basic concepts through a lot of repetition. And some books have a good bit of repetition within the first like half of it as they're getting started. And other books are like, okay, well, here's about 2 pages on quarter notes. Let's learn some 16ths now. So one of the notorious ones that I've used in the past where I've had to like repeat parts or find something to supplement it used to be like the old style, the Rubanks one, where it works in some cases as you're starting as a supplement, but as a book on its own, it's not something I would start with normally for somebody who's starting at like age 6 or 7, because it gets really heavy duty really quick. So that's kind of how I start with that. So I'm always looking for something that gives them plenty of time to try out different permutations and to repeat concepts and to really drive it home, in addition to what I'm doing outside of the book and the lesson.
My favorite 2 books are, I actually brought them over right here, are the syncopation one. I use this one all the time because it just has so many rhythms, so many versions of it. And then this is the one I use for drum set, is this Funky Primer.
Okay.
I use this one all the time. It's just a whole bunch of beats, just hi-hat, kick, and snare. So once I get through all the syncopation patterns and everything, most of them in that book are steady 8th note hi-hat, snare, and kick are where it changes. So there's normally a snare on 2 and 4 in the beginning of it, and kick on 1 and 3. Like that's just like the first page is just hi-hat, like the basic beat. And then it starts changing up the kick pattern, then adds some snares and some ghosts. And it's just a really great book for teaching different beats. Or when I can't think of a beat that goes with what we learned on the snare drum, I look in that book and go, hey, page 25, number 2 has a really good beat that is what we just did. So that's how I apply the syncopation and the Funky Primer book work really well together, because a lot of times it's the same rhythms that you play it on the snare that you're about to play on the drum kit, which they didn't know that yet, but now here's your page that you're about to learn in the Funky Primer. I use that book at every lesson probably.
Very cool. Well, that serves as a perfect segue to my next question I have to pitch for you guys. Once you've made the successful transition from snare only to kit, I know we talked a lot about like planning out what songs to teach, and kind of building a curriculum based on these songs to teach these concepts. But how much of your lesson curriculum time is devoted to just learning grooves out of a method book for drum set compared to just learning the repertoire? Is that something you gues really spend a lot of time in? Like, let's go through a whole bunch of grooves in like the Tommy Igoe book, for example, or anything like that?
Yeah, so for the Tommy Igoe book, I usually tend to use that with learners who are a little bit older. For the younger ones, I usually tend to write out stuff myself and have us work through different grooves as it relates to a song we're working on. Just because of the fact that I always felt like the drum set books tend to be a little bit more specialized in certain circumstances, and other ones are more like permutation based. In that it doesn't always have like the progression as you would kind of naturally find as you start from like learning simpler songs to more complicated ones. So I usually tend to kind of take that in my own direction for the younger learners who are like me, maybe 7, 8, or 9 as they're hitting the kit for the first time. For those who are like 10, 11, and 12, I really like the Igoe book. And one of the reasons being is because it has these fantastic backing tracks behind it that are live instruments. It's not MIDI. They're not like 30 seconds long. They're like 3-4 minutes long most of the time. It's a short chart, but it's really cool to play with because you can play them over and over again and make different permutations on it, which, not necessarily different permutations, I should rephrase, different versions of the beat on. One of the things I love about the book is that it gives like, here's the core beat, and here's like a slow version of it and a fast version of it. And then here's 2 variations for each one that you can do that, are for those who are intermediate, and the things that get a little bit more ridiculous for those who are slightly overqualified to play a 4 on the floor rock drum beat. But, it always reminds me of like, there was some video a long time ago of some drummer playing at a gig where they were playing like, every girl's crazy about a sharp dressed man by ZZ Top, and the drummer was just like going way over the top and like, this guy's overqualified for what he's doing. Like,
yeah. I think that's the title of the video is like when you're overqualified for the job. I think is.
I teach that song constantly. I love teaching that song.
Yeah, it's a great song. It's a very fun song to teach. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. I mean, you can see it from watching the silly video with the guy just going crazy. If you're able to do those crazy physical stunts while holding the beat, that means the beat has to be pretty basic in nature and pretty easy to hold. And that can really open the floor in all seriousness for a student to maybe we could try finding different ways to vary it. And that's where you can kind of tie it into what you're doing, like with the IGO book. Like, I like that about it too. I mean, I didn't even try the variations when I was taking the class in college because they just looked really intimidating. But I thought it was a really cool idea that like, it's like, here's exactly how much mileage you can get out of just one of these grooves.
Oh, I know.
All the different ways you can play around with it. And it just, for me as a non-drummer, it just fascinated me. It's like, wow, dude, really? Yeah, drummers really are musicians, and they get a bad rap, and I really hate that. It's so easy to hate on drummers because all they do is bang on things, but there's really such a when you get to like that advanced level of like that kit playing, and I remember like as a student at university, just like seeing like some of like the high-end jazz bands play and just watching the drummers just do their thing, and it literally like taking that class taught me such a higher level of appreciation for what drummers really do on the kit, and really just kind of, I remember like I found myself at concerts watching the drummer more than watching the piano player because it was like just something totally different and new that I didn't understand. It's like I kind of get what the piano guy's doing. He's voicing the chord this way and he's putting this extension on top, like all that stuff. It's not really news for me, but like just watching how many different ways a drummer can manipulate the beats and keep it moving without dropping a beat. It blew me away. And it's something it's definitely a bucket list thing for me to do is kind of get more into drum set, and, not just as a potential teacher, but also just for my own personal benefit. But
I for one will be completely happy to welcome you to the field because it's awesome. We welcome all newcomers and we have donuts for everybody who's joining.
Yeah, that's another thing. You never get drummers that like poop on other musicians too. Like, making fun of the violists or the bass players or the singers. Drummers are always like the ones that are just taking the brunt of the abuse. And I've come to hate that over the years, but that might be saved for our gripes segment later on.
We're just there to chill and have a good time, play some beats. That's really what we do most of the time.
Yeah, you guys are just there to literally hold the song together by the mere fabric of what it is.
Yes, that's nothing major. Most of us are just kind of we play, nothing too major because we're really just tired from bringing our gear and having to set it up.
With no one helping us ever.
No, that one never happens. Like, here, can I help with something? Yes, here, hold this case open, please.
Or if they do try to help them, they set it up wrong. So
they do.
Yeah, or they just drop them, or they don't handle them well. Or you're better off just doing it yourself. I can speak from a similar perspective as a keyboard player because it's kind of the same thing. We have a lot of stuff just to get a keyboard set up, but it's not as much as a drummer. I concede, but it's still more than some other members of the band. But
I think one of the things that I always found interesting when it came time for drums or teaching drums is the fact that like it's a more, I don't mean this word in a derogatory, it's a more mechanical type of experience for drumming because you're playing an instrument a way that no other instrumentalist or any performer really gets to play. It's something where we have something that is a wholly completely different experience from everybody else, and a large part of what we do is not just the mechanics of keeping time, but there's also like how you want your kit to look, how you want it to set up, what you need available to you, how you can fit like different things into a beat. Like I was talking about with the IGO book, and there's a ton of different variations that you can do. But for drummers, we're like, I wonder if I could add this in here and how that would sound. Or I wonder if like maybe if I slip like a cowbell part in here, how I could like integrate that going on. Because most of us are like, we're like kids in a candy shop, but we're just structured kids in a candy shop that have to like keep time apparently. So yeah.
It's like me trying to sneak it's like me trying to sneak my China cymbal into beats that shouldn't have a China cymbal in them.
Absolutely. Like, I wonder if I can use my China cymbal like a ride cymbal of sorts. I know Phil Collins did it, so I could get away with it too. Why not?
Yeah.
I mean,
I love me some China.
Oh my God. It's such a blast, like as far as the cathartic sense of playing drums, because if you're having a bad day, you can just like go and sit down at your drum kit and play some heavy duty stuff and just like you feel great afterwards.
Well, yeah, you get a literal physical workout playing the drums.
Oh, it is. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Especially depending on what you're playing.
So you naturally will be releasing those endorphins, and it's really cool. So
I think it's the only instrument that can get away with being called exercise.
Yeah, true.
Aside from singing, I would argue.
Yeah.
Singing is definitely a lot more physical than it lets on to be. When you realize that your whole body is the actual instrument, and just it could take a lot out of you to really do some high end singing. And I don't mean high end in pitch, just high end in any respect of. But anyway, so moving on to our one of our last points here is called pitched percussion's place. So talking things like marimba, xylophone, all that really fun kind of bell keyboardy sort of stuff. How does that fit in when you're teaching beginning percussionists? Is it more like you do that for a kid who's only doing it in school because they need to learn it, or is it something you try to introduce all of your percussion students to? Is it do you kind of is pitched percussion on equal footing as snare and drum set for like someone who wants to take drum lessons? Is that something that you guys really kind of get into?
It's tough to say, and a large part of it there is that pitch percussion is a rather important side of it too, because it's not just us hitting drums. There's other instruments as well that are pitched that we have as part of our repertoire. But I think the issue there is that when most people think, oh yeah, percussion lessons, yeah, they're learning how to play a drum kit, and that presents an issue. Is that one of the things I went through, and Claire, I'm not sure how this went for you when you were younger, but I didn't play any pitch percussion instruments for like the first 8 years I played drums until I was about like 14 or 15. And it took me actually taking piano lessons as a teenager to actually start playing pitch percussion instruments. And I felt a sense of like, I'm definitely lacking in a skill that I should be having. But at the same time, and I'm going to kind of say this for the good gripes thing, it was one of those things where I felt like I kind of was pigeonholed to some extent too. I find it being that like the pitch percussion aspect of it is something that is really cool to have. One of my favorite examples of that, and again, my favorite drummer of all time, Neil Peart, the drummer from Rush, he would have pitch percussion stuff going on in his kit as well. He'd have a set of bells off to the left, and in the older days, a set of chimes off behind him that he would use in different parts. Songs like Closer to the Heart or The Spirit of Radio all had pitch percussion parts in them. And without that understanding, they wouldn't be present. Now, are they a main factor of what's going on right, in the forefront? No, but it is important to know it. I think it's a big part of it. As to when it gets taught, that's more of an individual basis. I think a lot of times you have to make that determination if the student's ready to really start talking about that. It's a tough balance also, because if you're starting with something that feels like you're starting at the beginning again, some students may be like, well, I'd rather just concentrate on drum set. So I find myself starting that not at the very beginning, but within the first year, typically.
At least trying to introduce it, if nothing else.
Yeah.
Okay.
If nothing else, it also helps to learn to read pitch, especially if they're going to be in concert band, because they'll have to read pitch for timpani. So.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I read it like high-low for years until I actually knew what the notes were.
Yeah, the different note heads just tell you what drum to hit, right? It's just like the toms on a drum set staff.
Kind of. If it's two notes and you have two timpani, yeah, one's high, one's low. That's all that matters. I don't know if it's in pitch or not, but I know I'm hitting the correct one. So
at least I'm hitting the right one of these big guys, But
yeah.
Spoken like a true amateur timpanist. All the timpanists that are following the channel are rolling their eyes too now with the bass players from before. So, Claire, have you ever really had experience with pitch percussion, like whether it was in school band or anything like that?
I didn't do school band, so I haven't really had basically any experience with pitch percussion, which now I feel like I should, but
hey, better late than never. Just ask us, right?
Yeah, I don't really have access to a pitch percussion instrument, so
That's probably the hardest part of this is just getting the instruments, because like a decent marimba is what, thousands of dollars, right?
Oh yeah.
So what is that's another question, Russ. How do we even get a student like started? What do? You just
bells or xylophone.
Okay.
Because anything more than that, like if you're talking a vibraphone, you're talking several thousand. If you're talking a marimba, depending on the size, you're talking like double-digit thousands. So yeah,
that's really a lot of money,
because they are like rather large instruments. And the part of that is unfortunate about is it becomes this thing where they don't get really covered outside of like a school concert band setting, because it's like 3 times as expensive as the drum kit half the time, which is ridiculous to me. But I mean, obviously there's a lot of not moving parts, but there's a lot of different parts.
A lot of craftsmanship that goes into crafting each of the bars. It's
right.
Crazy.
I think probably one of the most beneficial ones you can literally start with is just glockenspiel. which is, the bells basically to start, because you can use that if, like, say you're trying to write a part for a song and there's a melody that you really want to accentuate, and you need like an extra bit of attack on that. You take like a brass mallet and use that for hitting a few different parts of the melody notes, the really important ones. And if you're really dialed into it and you have like that going on, you could also like keep like your foot going at the same time to kind of get those melody parts going as you're keeping the bass drum part going. And you find that you do this like double duty part that's kind of a cool break in just doing all the standard drum set stuff, because I feel like we spend most of our time basically learning how to play basic drum set beats, and then we spend the rest of it trying to find ways to creatively not play every single part we just learned and like play in the parts we didn't learn before. And this is another aspect of it that I think is really kind of cool, that adds something strong to it, but not everybody always has the chance to do. So Claire, it is never too late to start. And the best part is it's the same layout as piano. So if you know piano, you can play melodies.
And further from that, that could be a nice bridge for a percussion student to then branch out and get into piano and then get into some of the non-percussion families of instruments. It's a really good bridge.
Too. So yeah.
For me, I was kind of the backwards. Like I did piano, of course, for, all of my growing up. And then my first percussion experience was playing in the pit of my school marching band junior year, that was the easiest thing for me to learn because it was just a piano, except now I just got 2 big fingers instead of 10. But it was the same instrument. So I learned it really quickly, and I quickly became section leader, which was awesome. So, and then from there, like, there's all this other cool, like, stuff to hit with hammers and sticks and stuff. This is kind of cool. And kind of getting more into the percussion stuff. Like,
I wonder what it sounds like if I hit this thing with this thing.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. It's pretty cool.
I've also noticed that a lot of my students who want to play, a lot of my piano students who want to be drummers, because I have a lot of them, are normally playing piano because their parents say they have to learn piano before they can play another instrument. And I was wondering, honestly, how you guys thought of that with drums. Do you think it's important? Sorry if I'm taking your role of asking questions. I had a question.
No. It's not like it's just a framework. We just have like a little sketch of stuff we want to talk about. There's not like specific.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you think it's important to learn piano before you can learn drums?
Funny enough, I would say no.
I say no as well, and it's hard to explain that to a parent.
For anyone, like any of my students or parents or whoever, like the first thing I'll say as any new family comes in, if they're not sure of what they're supposed to do, of course I recommend piano. I always recommend piano, even for like a kid who wants to learn another instrument. There are definitely situations in which learning piano first can be very, very beneficial. And even if if it's not required, it's probably still a good idea. Like piano just helps you learn anything. So, and I think one of the reasons that I branched out as quickly as I did and became the multi-instrumentalist I am today is because of my piano background. I started on piano, so picking up every other, I even from doing pit in concert band, I picked up trombone, I picked up baritone, I got, I even ended up getting into saxophone, started taking flute lessons like a year later, and I just started collecting instruments. There's a whole band's worth of instruments in my closet, and I can play all of them. And I think it's all because like I just had to know how to get a sound out of this thing and where the notes are, because I already know how to read treble clef and bass clef, and I know all the different scales and ranges and all this stuff from being a piano player. So I will always argue that starting on piano is an excellent idea. But a lot of like so many of the skills that are transferable from piano to so many other instruments are not transferable to drums. So if you have a kid who's coming in that wants to be a drum set student, there's definitely no reason that you should have to do piano first, I would say. And of course, that probably sounds ironic coming from a piano teacher, but you're really comparing an apple to an orange at that point. And you learn rhythm on piano, sure. And so for me, learning to read drum set notation was easy because I could read pitch already, and it's really not that much different. But I would say that a lot of parents, I think they kind of hear that general consensus that, you got to do piano before you can do like really any other of the cooler instruments. And that's definitely, I would say that applies the least to the drums than anything else.
Go ahead. Sorry, no, go ahead.
At the school I teach at, we don't offer other private lessons until age 7, but we have a group class called Kids and Keys that's piano. Okay. So I think the school that I teach at is very like we want to start on piano, but it's funny because we do sometimes offer younger kids drum lessons.
Okay.
Yeah. They don't start on piano if they're really set on I want to play drums. But
do you guys have like a kid program for drums? Because that would be equally effective?
We have a younger kid group class. Yeah.
Okay. So
But the Kids and Keys class is what a lot of the parents are like, oh, we should start on piano. And it is a really good program. They get a lot with reading rhythm and reading pitch and everything like that, and the basic positions and everything. But I sometimes have a hard time seeing how parents want their kid to play piano before they play drums, except for the rhythm standpoint and the just doing more than one thing at once. It's I agree with Dan in the way that I think you can go straight into drums. I honestly, I started with drums and then picked up everything else. And it was really hard to pick up everything else after starting with drums. It was like, pitch, what's that? But
yeah, I dealt with the same thing. So
yeah, I went from drums to voice and then other instruments. So I had probably the weirdest track of I'm a drummer. Now I want to learn how to sing. And then I have to accompany myself.
Yeah,
I
and
can't just
like
play
I said
drums and
before,
sing.
for a good couple of months before Claire moved out of Pennsylvania, she was my piano student. And that was super fun, by the way. But it's funny, just listening to Claire talk about it, I don't want to interject and cut Russ off. I know he had something to say, and we'll get to him in a minute. But it just had me thinking, and this just popped in my head, and this is probably the reason that you're having that issue with so many of your parents. Parents just don't want to hear their kid starting with drum lessons. You know, like you don't want to hear them practice on drums. At least that's one of the benefits to playing the piano is right away you just touch the key and it sounds nice. And on week one, you can play Mary Had a Little Lamb and it sounds like the song. You know, so many other instruments have a big learning curve of like, you know, there's all the horror stories you get of your kid starting on a music instrument. And, you know, like I just had a parent on Facebook a couple weeks ago, like post a video of her kid who just picked up trombone in his 4th grade band, and he's like going around the house like making these awful noises on the trombone and terrorizing his sister. And it's just like all of these things, when you pick up all these other instruments, there's all these learning curves. You know, violins have these awful scratchy sounds because you're putting the bow down too hard. Flute, you do all this blowing and nothing really happens yet. But with piano, you don't need any extrinsic fine motor. You just touch the note and it sounds great. And, you know, I think a lot of parents like kind of lean to that because, you know, pianos are really cheap and easy to get and they sound nice. And when their kid is first starting out, like they right away, it's something they can tolerate listening to over and over in the house while they're cooking or cleaning or doing whatever else with their other children. So I think that's a part of it. And I hate to say that because, you know, no one wants to hear a drum student in the first, especially if they're starting on snare only, just hearing, just all this, incessant tapping away on a really repetitive, not pitched sounding thing. It's like, what is this Morse code thing going on in the living room? It's driving me up a wall. So I think that's probably part of it. The parents just don't want to hear it. And that could easily later segue very well into our good gripes section, because that is such a awful misconception that you shouldn't have, and you don't want to starve your children of this opportunity to learn something that's really, really cool, so Russ, sorry, I took up the floor for the last.
No, it's all good. No, unfortunately, I think that is a valid point, Dan. You're right. In some cases, I've had parents who are like, yeah, they wanted to learn drums, but I don't want to hear it constantly throughout my house. And I'm like, I get that. It still kind of stinks too, because you're kind of robbing them that chance to learn what they want to learn. I was lucky I grew up in a household where my father was also a drummer. So there was no issues with
Downey the second.
Yep.
Drummer in a rock band for God, how many years?
Oh God, right? Like 40 years close.
Does he still play?
Nah, he doesn't play anymore.
Oh, okay.
But just for years, it was, no major issue for me to be in the house of practice. As a matter of fact, my parents were usually asking me to practice more most of the time, which,
imagine that. And you grew up to become a successful music teacher.
I have no idea how that happened. I think a big part of it was that was a supportive environment that was there that helps a lot. And unfortunately, there are some cases where, and look, and it doesn't necessarily be a situation where like the parents want to hear they may live in an apartment complex where they can't.
Yeah, noise complaints.
Part of it too, or live in a place where they can't be having extra noise stuff going on all the time, and that is one unfortunate part of it. Now, obviously, there's electronic kits, but that's like several $1,000.
Yeah, they're very expensive.
Is like a few $100.
And cheaper ones don't really function that well. They're not
No, they're not. They're not great. They're pretty.
The look at Claire's face says it all.
They're pretty not good. I'm just gonna put it that way. But yeah, as far as like the whole piano and drum thing goes, I think in that sense, I understand the benefit of them, thinking, it's helpful for the kid to learn how to read pitch and how to play a pitched instrument. I think in that sense, that's where pitch percussion can help bridge that gap, because you can get some of that, which helps to be able to read pitch later on, especially because you're reading a non-transposing instrument in treble clef, which leads you to violin to start if you want to go to that, or leads you to flute, or well, that's pretty much about it for treble clef ones that don't transpose most of the time, unless you're going to piano later on. But at the same time, you at least are getting some pitch reading in there. You can learn percussion and piano concurrently, but with the understanding that
very effective. I've seen that happen with students
Mhm.
at numbers of different schools that I've taught at.
I had a student who was actually learned both, and eventually actually transitioned mostly into concentrating on piano as well. But was really helpful for having that background and learning those rhythms before they went full time into piano. But you can learn them concurrently. They just with the understanding that they are very, very different approaches and very different mindsets in how you approach it.
Very different skill sets you get from exploring the two instruments too. But
yeah, I mean,
you can play the piano and you can play the drums and you could sing.
Yeah, you can do anything at that point.
You could do everything else.
Yeah,
easy.
I did.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I did drums for the whole time I was at Rock and Roll after school, and then I switched out other instruments along the way.
Mm-hmm.
But I think drums was the only one I stayed with. But near the end is when I fell in love with piano, when I was just like, I can play guitar, I can play bass, I can sing, I can play drums, I can play ukulele, whatever. But I was like, but the one instrument that everyone's supposed to know how to play, I can't play. So I feel like I should learn this now. And now piano has become my second favorite instrument. But
good.
I feel like those two, learning them together, I feel like after you guys talking about that, I think that is important too, is how much better of a musician you can become if you learn both together too.
Yeah, and the piano is just a really useful tool for singers. It's a useful tool for other instrumentalists. Even beyond the basic implication of just using it to tune your horn. But even like for all sorts of things, you could use it as a really valuable supplement to learning all. Like I go to the piano all the time when I'm doing stuff on guitar, when I'm doing stuff on brass, whatever. I go to piano mainly for me because piano's my main thing. But I think it's just more so than that because it's a very valuable tool.
No, I mean, you're right. I mean, I had kind of like a weird progression through learning piano, because I had a piano and a keyboard a good several years before I even actually took lessons. So I had this time where I actually went through this inner ear training basically on my own of actually learning how to play stuff just by ear alone. And that was super helpful in developing a much stronger sense of pitch, because a lot of my music training beyond the lessons I took in being a concert band in school was I wouldn't call it hodgepodge, but a very unorthodox smattering of things. And part of it was because of my father having been in rock bands, that he was starting to sing and play drums at the same time. And so I also learned how to sing and sing harmonies. But when it came time for piano, nobody in the house really played, but we had a piano that was an heirloom from a family member. And so I'm sitting there trying to figure out, I have this book of Styx's greatest hits. I'm trying to figure these out one note at a time, figured out reference pitch. I'm like, I think if I remember correctly, this is this note, so maybe I can figure this out. I'll never forget though, the feeling at age 12 of finally figuring out how, the first song I fully learned how to play on keyboards was Subdivisions by Rush, which I was so ecstatic when I did that. And when I found out later, and I was learning how to play piano, I'm like, this is great. I love doing this too. I wish I would have done this sooner alongside of learning drums, because it brought a whole new dimension of being a musician that I had no clue of before. I'm not sure how well I would have handled it if I started when I was 8 or 9 alongside drums. I'm sure I would have given it a good try, but I think you can learn them concurrently, but it can't be starting concurrently. It can't. It's very difficult. They're very polar opposites in that sense.
Unless you're just willing to commit the time. If you have a student that's really into music and, it's just really has that unparalleled passion for it. Yeah, jump in, do 2 instruments and put in double the amount of practice time every week. And, maybe you cut out another extracurricular activity and make a sacrifice for music. I've seen it done. It can be done. It doesn't happen often, but it can be done.
That's what I did.
It's really cool when it does happen. I know for me, for years in high school, like I was doing something with music every day of the week. There was like a string ensemble on Tuesday, and then I had a guitar lesson on Wednesday, and my piano lesson was on Friday. I was teaching music lessons on Thursdays and Mondays, and it's like literally every day was like something musical. And it was at that point, it was one of the happiest moments of my life because I was really actively working towards. At that point, though, I knew I wanted to go on to music school and become an educator, so I was actively working towards that. So I was kind of an exception. I was not your normal like just kid taking music lessons. I was like the music guy since I was like 12. Like all my friends know me because I can play the piano. It's one of those kind of things. But it's funny, Russ, you talking about, like how learning piano as a drummer taught you like to really think in that other dimension of being a musician. And the same exact thing happened on the reverse for me as a pianist who kind of got into drum set way later after doing everything else and then kind of getting that newfound appreciation. So that's all the stuff that we like. What about the stuff that we don't like? Now is the time for our weekly segment of Good Gripes, where we get to just kind of shed some shade and talk about some things that are bothering us in the current music instruction scene, whether that be something in lessons, something from the business end, maybe. So I'd like to start with our special guest, Claire. What are some of your good gripes?
Teaching online band is difficult.
Oh yeah, I can understand that.
I haven't even tried it. I don't even plan to try it.
It's interesting. It teaches the teacher a lot. It also teaches the student a lot. I have a student who doesn't like to turn on their camera when we're doing online band through Zoom. It's very difficult to tell because they're the singer if I can't hear them. And sometimes I have to go by reading lips. And if their camera's not on, I don't even know if they're in the room. But the biggest thing that I've worked out with that is Zoom likes to block out background noise. It's not fun.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Now I
figured out how to fix that. Yeah.
So I think we should talk about that just in case there's anyone out there who doesn't know. Whether that be student signups or whether that be maybe teachers that are getting into music education now, even during COVID, and because even after this whole COVID nightmare is over, Zoom lessons is going to be a thing that's going to stick around. It's going to be an available service. For many reasons, and I feel like we should take a quick second to kind of talk about that because I found a video right when this whole pandemic first hit and everything was on initial lockdown. I found a really cool tutorial video by a man named Hugh Sung, who teaches piano and singing and works at Cunningham Piano Company, and he does a lot of online lessons. And he gave this really great like YouTube video kind of tutorial thing. Maybe we could have Jeff link it in the description or something for any teachers out there as an available resource. But anyway, so he does like a whole thing on like talking about like getting into like the audio settings, and it still does it to an extent. Zoom still tries to take control of things it shouldn't take, but definitely having that resource. So for all of you Zoomers out there, if you go into your audio settings, you'll have Zoom defaults to automatically adjust your microphone's volume. So it factors in for background noise, like if you're like on like a busy street and there's like cars honking outside and stuff like that, it tries to cut all those things out, basic room noise, from lights and air conditioners and generators and whatever else, heaters, if in the colder months. So by turning the automatic adjust volume function off, you can then fix your volume, and then it's going to have, it's not going to sound as nice, but at least you get to hear everything, and it definitely works much better for a music scenario. So but to get into that, you want to go into your more advanced settings, and there's a whole bunch of different audio settings, at least in the original version. I'm actually not seeing it here on this newest version I have updated, but there is a bunch of advanced it's on the main page now. So as Claire pointed out, suppress background noise. As far as Zoom is concerned, any musical instrument making noise is background noise that needs to be eliminated, because it's primarily used for like big, larger scale, distant conference calls, like on like a more like kind of office environment. So naturally, you're not going to have musical instruments in a business meeting. So I can't tell you how many times I would have a guitar student like strum a big E chord and I hear none of it because Zoom just cuts it all out completely. I just had the same issue happen with the student I was talking about before with trombone, who's now taking trombone lessons, and it's super fun. And he's sitting there and I could see him like putting all this air through the horn, and like I heard about a second of his low concert B flat, and then all the rest of it just got cut out completely during his lesson. So it puts a big damper on music lessons. And for me, it's just working as a private teacher, one-on-one, but I can imagine it being way worse in a band environment. So making sure that you set, there used to be a way to turn suppressing background noise off completely, but they've recently updated it. I'm just looking at it now. The default setting is automatic, which of course you definitely don't want, but then it breaks it down to low, medium, and high. So there's always going to be some degree of noise suppression, but if you set it to the lowest setting, it will be the most helpful for you getting across musically, whether you're demonstrating as a teacher or whether you're having your students do it on their devices for their lessons. The only caveat with that is a lot of times they're using mom or dad's laptop, which they're using Zoom for like more professional stuff at work, and then they're going to change the settings back. So it's one of those things you have to kind of remind the parents regularly, like, hey, make sure you have your noise suppression features turned off or at least on low for the lesson, so I can actually hear your kid play in the lesson. Because it's funny how effective Zoom really is at cutting out the audio completely. So anyway, what are some other gripes you have about online teaching? Or just teaching in general, or anything really?
Well, still with the Zoom band, having them go, all right, let's start playing. And then they're all at different times. And then it's, oh wait, I can't hear the singer. Hey, can you turn your your microphone volume up? Hey, drummer, can you turn your microphone volume down? Let's try that again.
How do you guys get anything done?
We do get a lot done.
That's amazing. I can't believe that.
We've been having, we do have some bands come in person, but the ones who are comfortable. And then the other bands that we've been doing Zoom with since March, I had my little girl band this morning. They have been doing band together through Zoom for March. They're best friends. Next week's Halloween, we have class. They're coming in and going outside out front, and they're doing their practice out front is how we're going to do it in their Halloween costumes.
Oh, so, very cool.
But yeah, so online band is my biggest
and I'm sure you are not alone. There are probably hundreds of other teachers out there that are having issues teaching ensembles online right now. Like I said, for me, I haven't even tried it. I haven't even bothered. I've had my hands full just with doing private lessons one-on-one with my students, handling other aspects of my business. But so I can't complain. I'm not even going into that domain for the foreseeable future. Maybe in a few years when technology improves, maybe we could find better ways to get live streamed sessions or something that lets for more productive music making remotely. Because right now Zoom is the best we got. Big plug for Zoom. Zoom is how we're doing everything right now, and it's awesome, but it's not designed for music instruction, and it shows in times when it's needed most. So Russ, what about you? What are some of your gripes?
Okay, so I'm going to keep this one in the percussion realm for this one. My biggest gripe for percussion instruction at large is pigeonholing into pitched or non-pitched, especially in schools. This is a big deal that, like, wouldn't have driven me as nuts when I was a student, but it drives me nuts now. And a big part of it is the fact that if you play drums, you will be playing non-pitched percussion the majority of the time. If you play mallets or you play piano before, you'll be playing mallets. And that's it, basically. So I have rather a cavalier attitude towards it, but the deal there
get on the box, do it.
Well, a lot of it comes down to time more than anything else. And I feel like I'm going to mention that every single time I mention ensemble practices. But a lot of times it comes down to when you're teaching percussionists, if you're teaching them both non-pitched and pitched, especially in a concert band school setting, you're talking about trying to do twice the amount of work in the same amount of time as you would for any other instrumentalist.
Which is why a lot of directors don't do it.
Right. It basically usually winds up being like a parent says to the band teacher, my kid plays piano. Can they join the band? Sure. They're going to play mallets. Okay. And then another one, my kid wants to play drums. Okay. They're going to be playing snare drum and bass drum or crash cymbals most of the time. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times it's like, because of the amount of time we actually have available for that type of instruction, there's very little crossover. Now, I will say this, there's been an active attempt I've seen to try and have more crossover, but not on repertoire. It's always for warm-ups. So at least I know, like I've seen some percussionists who typically play non-pitched who are playing like scales for warm-ups in class on mallets. But when it comes time for playing the actual repertoire they're working on, there's no crossover. And again, a lot of that is a time issue because the amount of time it takes to get a percussionist skills on both ends of it up to the same level would be double that of what you would spend for any other instrumentalist. So that begs the question, why not have double the lessons? And that's kind of the way I feel about it.
Well, sure, that's the perfect solution. It's just a matter of
exactly,
who wants that, in a private lesson setting, what parent is willing to pay for double the lessons and double the time. I mean, I consider myself very fortunate. I have a lot of families in my business that are willing, like, oh, I see the value of doing this, and yeah, let's add a violin lesson to my son's piano lesson every week and have him work on both. And then that kid goes through with both instruments and he does great, and he gets the weekly reinforcement, and none of us, we're all happy, and especially I'm not complaining because I'm getting that extra income for that same family. But a lot of times parents in a private music lesson setting aren't going to be so giving to, like, oh yeah, well, let's do all the mallet stuff and let's do all of the drum set stuff. Let's do all the pitched and the non-pitched. And especially as far as, putting that into a time budget for a school board meeting of, like, oh, if we just had double the band time, we'd be able to accomplish so much more and have, like, way more colorful material represented at concerts, and we could really deliver something really, really remarkable. But
don't I know it?
But then there's, where does the time come from then? Do we take it away from the theater kids? Do we take it away from the sports teams? Do we take it away from other extracurricular activities? Do we pay that teacher for the extra instructional time for, having them come in for 4 hours a day instead of 2? It becomes a big issue and a real hot topic. And that's probably something we'll circle back to a lot of these gripe sections. So
no, I think just, really one of the solutions, at least that I've seen, is that some schools, and this is more a regional thing than anything else. I've heard some examples of this being down in Texas, where schools have like a percussion specialist who comes in to teach their percussionists. And in which case, that's really kind of a cool concept too, because like that means that they're getting more focused time with somebody who is like specifically going to focus on all the aspects that are important for doing that, which means they're obviously going to get a greater leg up on what they're doing with that. Sure. But unfortunately, as far as the time goes from it, it really is something where in order for them to get the full breadth of what they need to be able to do, you need to be able to spend double the time on it. And unfortunately, this is why percussionists sometimes like kind of get separated into different camps and kind of get the reputation they do sometimes. Non-pitch percussionists don't know when to stop playing, according to most teachers. And pitch percussionists usually have to tell them to play most of the time. So, unfortunately, that doesn't help that either, at least that it gets that reputation. But having gone through it myself personally for all my years of instruction in public school, as well as having taken lessons alongside of it, it's one of those things where like it still irks me to this day, and I try and right that wrong whenever I see it as much as I can.
Yeah, you have to be pretty strict when you're teaching percussion students.
It's hard to get them to stop playing.
That's a whole episode right there.
I've had to take so many sticks out of students' hands, not in a mean way, just they're playing, especially in bands, when they're just playing and you're trying to talk to the keyboardist saying, hey, can you play that part again? I didn't hear it because this one was playing. Can you?
If I had $1.
Oh yeah. But I mean, that's a good point. But I think a lot of that is something that you establish early on, that those are the expectations. And when they cross those expectations, you make sure you let them know, hey, you can't be doing that. You make a lot of sound and I need to be able to talk to people. I will say this, if you do that well enough, sometimes all you need to do is look in their direction.
Yeah.
That's like the whole.
I've gotten lucky to have that happen a couple times for me, like with some bands that I've coached over the years, is like just getting the look is enough sometimes.
Yeah.
Which is really satisfying. I hate to say it.
And, I found that with,
go ahead.
I found that with guitarists too. Not only percussionists, but guitarists like to turn.
Those were always the two biggest offenders. It was never the singer. It was never the bass player. It was never the keyboardist. They were always like, "I'll just play when you need me, and I'll be perfect," because I'm the only one in the whole band that's actually practicing between the actual rehearsals anyway. So like they're the ones that always got it down. Which this once you guys are finished, we could pretty easily segue into my gripe.
No, I think I'm good. I've been thoroughly slandered enough.
I was just gonna say my gripe has a lot to do with stereotypes in musicians. So,
all right, go for it.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, so I mean, and this is something I've already kind of had my segment on this earlier in this episode, and I feel like it's gonna come up pretty frequently whenever we do like drum set and percussion based episodes, because that's just my perspective as an instrumentalist, who's not explored percussion until that being like the last thing I learned as a music student was getting into drums and drum set and all things percussion. But yeah, that stereotype that drummers aren't musicians. That was something that was like kind of imbued within me growing up in like the rock band scene, and that was like that was just like the popular thing to say for like, and my teacher was guilty of it too. He was a keyboardist and an arranger and fantastic musician, recently deceased, God rest his soul. But he had like a whole thing, like, and he would always make cracks about drummers, like musician parking only, drummers park in the rear, and like it's and like not just because of that, but like there was like especially in the rock scene, there's like a big general consensus that the drummers are just kind of like these lunkheads that can't play anything. They just because they do this like simple repetitive mechanical stuff, and I just find that does such a huge disservice to such a huge body of musicians that are really the backbone of any successful band, whether that's a rock band, a concert band. Probably not so much in the orchestra. That's more the conductor's job to literally keep the time and keep everything together. But you try to think of any fantastic 19th century orchestral pieces and take the percussion away and see what happens. You know what I mean? So for me, like that stereotype just, it gets on my last nerve. Over the years, as I've grown and matured as a musician and as a teacher, and it's just so easy to crack those kinds of jokes for drummers. And I think that's really lousy, and that should stop. There are stereotypes about us as well, piano players, but most of them are more positive. Like we're always the ones that are putting in all like the actual time in the practice, and we're not afraid to spend hours in a practice room alone. Like we're all like loners and we do our own thing, but we're always really cool or whatever. Stereotypes about guitar players, that they're kind of just as bad as drummers in the regard of not knowing when to stop playing and exercise good rehearsal technique. That's definitely a thing, but for me though, guitar players deserve it, and I could say that as a guitar player. There's just a certain amount of egotism that goes unmatched in guitar world. So yeah, poor bass players. They never get any respect. They never get any time, and they're right next to the drummer, literally and figuratively speaking, in a lot of respects. And I feel that a lot of those uncredited musicians should get more credit. So
I'll put it to you this way.
That's my big one for the week, is that gripe.
I was going to say, try having a rehearsal for an ensemble that doesn't have a bass player and see how good it actually is.
Oh, yeah. See how long it goes before it falls off the rails entirely.
Yep.
Or it just doesn't sound full.
Yeah, that's part.
Yeah, it just sounds like it's lacking something. It's like, we need the bass there.
I will say this. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I will say this, and we've mentioned this in other episodes too. Even though there's some stereotypes about drummers, we are like the chillest group of people you'll ever meet, and we're one big family most of the time. We are more than happy to be like, hey, you want to play? Come on in. We'll get you a drum, and you can like hang out and play some drums with us.
Hey, you can take one of my sticks, because
yeah, I've got like 3
really nice
here. So here, you can have this pair. I'll play with like 2 others. But yeah, that's the one thing I love about being a percussionist, is that it's like one big family. There's almost no drama. Everybody just loves to kind of play drums and be chill about it. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, man. So I very much look forward to doing more episodes where we talk about this underrated, undercredited world of all things drums and percussion, and especially in the last few weeks as our community has started to grow and we've gotten a lot of interested people that are joining up on our Facebook page, which is great. We're getting some subscribers on our podcast channel, Pansy Podcast Productions, Triple P, and that's been really exciting to get these conversations going. So I'm gonna, every time we do these segments, I'm gonna, we just did a Rock Talk episode earlier this week, and I plugged the Teacher Talk one, so we're doing the Teacher Talk one. I'm going to plug so right now the 2 big talk shows are the Rock Talk Show and the Teacher Talk Show. Both of them have their own Facebook groups. The Rock Talk Show is a little more kind of open for everybody. Teacher Talk, we're obviously going to be a little more geared towards musicians and teachers. But that being said, we've reached out to tons of, a lot of, at least a lot of my colleagues and Facebook friends that maybe were teachers at one point and now aren't and are doing something else. We have a place for those people here as well. And I'm looking forward to the next several set of episodes where we get to bring in a lot more other guests like Claire on board, where we can kind of pick at their brain and see what other perspectives are for teaching all things teaching music. So it's been a lot of fun. And this is like our first really big like drum set one, really, that we're kind of getting into this. And there's many more drum-based episodes to come, and I'm excited about that because, like I said, that for me, that's for me, this was like a lecture. I could just kind of tune in and ask a bunch of questions, and I got to learn a whole bunch of stuff. I even took a couple notes. So hopefully those of you watching found it valuable and a nice resource of information, and if nothing else, just a fun thing to kind of listen to and get your brain going and thinking of different ways to apply yourself as a music teacher. If nothing else, hope you had fun listening to us talk. And with that, we'll pretty much close up shop here, and stay tuned for next week. We're going to do another episode. We're going to go out of the world of drums and get into the world of guitars and have a nice little guitar episode. More details on that to come in the future, but stay tuned. I'm updating the Facebook page almost every day. Also, Doc Rocker Music has a Twitter, has an Instagram. If you're in any of those other platforms, tune in. Instagram, I live stream practice sessions every week just for fun, and that's been really cool. People have been joining in on that. So yeah, more to come. Stay tuned. And until then, thanks for watching.